Hello, my name is Kira Lussier. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Toronto, Mississauga, and my paper today is entitled From Papers to Programs, Courts, Corporations, Clinics, and the Battle Over Computerized Psychological Testing. So I'll jump right in. If you've ever taken a personality test through your doctor, your work, your school, or perhaps just for fun, you've likely accessed it through a computer interface. Computer software administered the test, algorithms scored the test, and maybe even produced the report you're given about your personality. The results from this test might then help determine what your medical diagnosis is, whether you get a job, what career path is suggested to you, or how you understand your own personality. The results of these computerized psychological tests can have important consequences. Decades earlier, psychologists, computer sciences, and tech firms had undergone the laborious process of constructing and validating these same computerized psychological tests. They developed software to administer, score, and interpret the tests that were then used in realms from medical diagnosis to business hiring. In this talk today, I focus in particular on one firm, National Computer Systems, which developed software for one widely used personality test, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, as a lens onto broader questions about the history of computerized testing, as well as debates about fairness and bias in algorithmic systems. I look at three different domains that grapple with the impact of computerized psychological testing: law, business, and psychology. Across these domains, there were distinct worries and promises about the impact of computer-based testing systems. Courts were concerned with intellectual property and compliance with employment equity laws. Businesses were concerned with IP as well, but also profits and widespread sales. And psychologists focused on user qualifications and scientific standards, concerned with the outsourcing of human expert judgment to algorithms and access to the decision rules undergirding these algorithms. My methods: I'm trained as a historian of technology and science and business, so I use that combined with the analytical tools of science and technology studies to understand psychological tests as complex scientific objects. My data includes legal documents like court proceedings and patents, business press and records, scientific journals, and psychological manuals. This talk pulls from a larger project on the history of psychological testing in American business, science, and society. As I show in this talk, the statistical techniques, computational technology, and public debates engendered by computerized psychological testing from the 1960s to the 1980s serves as an important origin point for current debates about fairness and bias in algorithms. Such concerns are particularly acute when algorithms are used to make decisions with important consequences, as in the case of companies that use AI technology to screen applicants for jobs based on their emotional and psychological traits. So the guinea pig for computerized test interpretations is the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, called MMPI for short. It's a multi-scale personality test developed at the University of Minnesota in the 1940s, which bestowed its name. In the 1950s, it had become one of the most widely used general personality inventories. It has 16 different scales that assess different facets of personality, and had gathered an extensive research literature around it, which made it a good candidate for computerization. Computers had long been involved in scoring psychological and educational tests. But with the new wave of computational technology, computers are now being integrated to interpret the results and produce reports based on test scores, with less intervention from the human expert. There are two main approaches used in creating these computer systems: actuarial or expert systems models, and this distinction is still relevant in the technology and algorithmic technology today. The methodological foundations for the actuarial approach was laid by psychologist Paul Meehl, who was involved in the development of the MMPI. He applied these actuarial techniques from statistics to analyze personality data in what he called a cookbook method. It involved tracking out the relationships between combinations of scores on each of the 16 MMPI scales, with the goal of deriving a set of consistent, explicit rules that could be used in diagnosing patients, and creation of code type books, which had common types of profiles with MMPI scores. These CBTIs, as they became to be known, computer-based test interpretations, basically allowed psychologists to automate the decision rules for interpreting psychological test scores, programming decision rules based on a consistent pattern of responses. Meehl argued, and his followers, that actuarial methods were in fact superior to human interpretations because they're more consistent and thus less prone to bias. And this is a claim we'll see repeated throughout the process of computerizing tests. In practice, despite the distinctions, many interpretive schemes combine elements of expert systems and actuarial models, in part because the kind of pure cookbook method cooked up by Paul Meehl didn't really have there wasn't enough of the empirical research literature to actually follow it. So they did build in some of the expert systems approaches in terms of thinking of how a psychiatrist would diagnose a patient. The first commercially available computer program for the MMPI was created in the late 1960s at a New Jersey psychiatric clinic. This program was marketed as a way to free up the clerical labor of scoring and producing reports for the psychologist and allowing him or her to spend more time on treatment and diagnosis. At this clinic, the Roche Psychiatric Clinic, they also soon marketed the software as a tool in hiring, arguing that personality tests could be fruitfully used for detecting emotional imbalance in job applicants, and I'll come back to this later. And I'll turn now, as a brief introduction to the overview of MMPI, turn now to origins of the National Computer Systems. The company was founded in 1962 on the basis of a powerful new optical scanner technology that could connect optical scanning technology, which had been used for several decades to score psychological tests, connected it to digital computers. The history of psychological testing and computational technologies really go hand in hand over the course of the 20th century. In the wake of World War I, mass psychological tests became widely used in government, business, education, and the kind of steady march of newer technologies from electromagnetic pricks, punch cards, tabulating machines, and then later the electronic computer. The history of national computing systems then can really be seen as a way to a series of attempts to make computerized test scoring interpretation cheaper and faster and more profitable. So earlier scanning technology could mainly generate the raw scores. It could tell you based on these scales what values each of the scales had. But by the 1980s, when hooked up to electronic computers, could perform more complex calculations, like analyzing the relationship between scales, as well as producing complex narrative reports. In the 1980s, NCS began pursuing a fairly aggressive strategy of mergers and acquisitions, moving from test scoring to the software for interpreting the tests. The most significant acquisition came in 1983 with the purchase of PSYCH Systems that had a program called FAccT. And running on an IBM microcomputer, this program required a combination of scanning hardware and a software program that allowed it to produce narrative interpretive reports for personality tests. And it drew on this same actuarial model theorized and developed by Paul Meehl, built around code type interpretations, so combinations of scores on each of the different scales. They noticed that individual scores on the different MMPI scales tended to cluster in certain patterns of responses that could indicate certain personality profiles. So this software program operated by first checking if the test results matched code types already programmed into the computer, which had attached these sentences or paragraphs description of what that meant in terms of personality. And then it could also check for high scores in various scales and can point out both consistent patterns as well as anomalies. By the mid-1980s, NCS was a flagship company in the booming industry of testing software providers, with steadily increasing revenues from both clinicians and companies buying their testing services. Yet, even as they were achieving growing success, they also faced an increasingly competitive marketplace of test software providers. Computer programs to administer and interpret the MMPI in particular had proliferated, connected to the increasing availability of computers in clinics, offices, and homes, as well as to a growing business appetite for technology to improve hiring. And so I won't get into, there's a much longer kind of history of business uses of psychological tests in particular that NCS was appealing to here. And so as part of their strategy of appealing to businesses, NCS heralded this program as a faster, more efficient, and more accurate system that could make more consistent, accurate, and less biased decisions, including in the realm of hiring. So one of their staff psychologists called the computer a perfectly reliable machine that could eliminate human error and mitigate bias. The computer's inability to exercise discretion was precisely its virtue. NCS argued that their system could help companies make hiring decisions in part by screening out employees with an undesirable trait so that it displayed undesirable scores on the MMPI and selecting for those with positive personality traits. And as you know, the companies that institute these testing programs are lucrative potential clients for companies like NCS. And for companies, they had kind of long been searching for possible ways to standardize hiring process through algorithmic tools and cutting through the masses of applicants. But the business of psychological testing was affected by legal debates and discussions around testing, which served to both help and hinder, depending on the particular laws in the particular companies, the use of testing and hiring. And so three major concerns shaped the kind of legal approaches to testing. First was privacy. As early as in the 1960s, with the same moment when the MMPI is being computerized, the United States Congress was investigating privacy concerns around the personality tests and hiring. MMPI asked probing questions about bodily function, sex, relationships, and religious beliefs. The rebuttal of test developers was that psychologists were not concerned with the individual's particular answer on the question, and that those would not be able to be accessed by the employer, but that it was the overall pattern of responses. And they maintained that knowledge of this pattern of responses was the purview of psychologists, and that this very secrecy was required to protect test validity. We'll see this being echoed again by companies in their algorithmic uses of psychological tests. The second major concern was intellectual property. The major case was University of Minnesota versus Applied Innovations. Test developers argued that copyright was necessary to provide protections and incentives to creators and companies to construct and validate psychological tests, work that had become more laborious due to legal considerations. Another rival company had developed a testing software for the MMPI. As I mentioned, it had become a competitive marketplace for psychological testing software. NCS and University of Minnesota successfully argued, though, that the computerized psychological tests that they had developed deserved copyright protection as an authored product. That both psychological tests themselves, the software, as well as in scoring norms and all the apparatus around tests, was subject to copyright, which was an important case. And in the broader paper, I go into more detail about this, and I'm happy to answer questions. But related specifically to this question of fairness and bias is the issue of discrimination. With civil rights legislations of the employment equity legislation of the mid-1960s, tests came under legal scrutiny. A significant case in 1971, Griggs versus Duke Power Company, mandated new legal requirements for testing programs, that tests not have adverse impact on protected classes, and that tests show a demonstrated connection between the test and the nature of the job. Personnel departments and industrial psychologists scrambled to respond to these new requirements, and they did so by adjusting to these new requirements by revising test content and scoring them. In doing so, statisticians and psychologists reoriented questions about discrimination and bias in hiring to technical concerns about test design and scoring. We see in the kind of broader archival and historical materials, industrial psychologists are trying to grapple with the meaning of a fair test versus a biased test, debates that are very similar to kind of the questions around what's a fair or biased algorithm, and specifically in their social uses. And so I'll move now to the last kind of major section and concern, which is the concern among psychologists. And this is also where we get right into the heart of the question about the access to algorithms that are underpinning this scoring system. Since the origin of industrial and applied psychology in the early 20th century, psychologists have struggled to navigate the tension between their desire to maintain scientific standards around tests with the commercialization of psychological product. And that's spread into the very kinds of business and home that we've seen. So both as computerized test interpretation is becoming more common, both companies like NCS, as well as the professional body of psychologists, American Psychological Association, developed guidelines for the appropriate use of tests. There are two main concerns. The first was the qualification of test users who could buy and use psychological tests. And the second was the accuracy and accessibility of the algorithms used to calculate scores and generate interpretive reports. Computerized test interpretations did make it easier for businesses to use these tests, but also kind of risked, again, the same dilution of legitimacy. But the big issue, and I think one that really cuts to the heart of the issues being debated at this conference, is this concern about access to the algorithms underpinning the scoring and interpretive systems. So the scientific status of all psychological tests rested on a very particular type of test validation and to the worries about validity of tests and reliability. In creating computerized versions of psychological tests, though, companies wanted to protect their intellectual property, which had been reaffirmed by this course case as well. So, worried about test developers, worried about theft of their work, were loath to reveal these decision rules, whereas psychologists said, well, this actually makes, in some cases, the interpretation of the test is dependent on the programming of the software. So who's actually programming it? Do they have psychological expertise? And so it's also a tension between different kinds of expertise here. And these could have major consequences, especially in high-stakes situations like hiring. So the editor of a newsletter that reviewed software, computers, and psychiatry, worried about software programs that didn't only interpret test scores, but actually gave advice to managers based on the personality test scores of their employees, risking outsourcing consequential decisions to computers. Quote, you could see someone being fired because the computer says to do it. And so as you can see, a lot of the concerns that we have today about algorithmic hiring have their precedent decades earlier in these computerized systems for psychological testing. So as I've shown today, and this slide kind of gives some of the kind of main conclusions that I've tried to show, and the broader paper, of course, fleshes them out. So that psychologists, computer scientists, and firms constructed a body of research on statistical models of bias, fairness, and discrimination that influenced today's discussions around bias. So, for example, actuarial techniques developed by Paul Meehl have now been deployed in attempts to debias selection procedures, because Meehl advocated that we could use these actuarial techniques to mitigate the risks of human bias. And so that's been this kind of common claim. But of course, as I've shown, these computerized psychological texts are kind of these hybrid and complex objects and embeds both human expertise and technological innovations. And there's many layers of mediation involved at every step of the way. So we both see across all these various domains consistent claims that computerized testing could provide technical solutions to thorny problems from medical diagnosis to hiring. Even at the same time as these courts and psychologists are pointing out the kind of complexities. And we also see this similar kind of criticisms and concerns levied about the use of algorithms and the use of computerized psychological testing. Concerns about privacy, discrimination, bias, secrecy, and proprietary concerns all intersect in this case study. So as I've tried to show that using this kind of historical lens, bringing the intersection of the histories of the business and technology and psychology involved at stake, I think can shed new light on today's discussions of our fairness and bias in algorithmic systems. Thanks for listening, and I'll just say that the full paper is available, published in a kind of early edition in the Annals of the History of Computing. Thank you very much.